think the topic of tonight's symposium and the notion of, I thought a lot about this idea of shared space, shared spaces, and then the idea of what, in effect, the museum is. And, inevitably one always does this searching on the web for all kinds of things. And, of course, I found this, which I thought was sort of an interesting thing about the notion of experience. In 1996, there was a book written by Sir Nicholas Sirota, who was the director of the Tate Gallery at the time, called Experience or Interpretation, which set out many different and interesting ideas about the direct experience of art and then the interpretive strategies that went with it. And again, I think we have a little overlap here, but to problematize where we are now, I've equally pulled some images together, one of which Christiane has already shown in her presentation, of people photographing within the museum. Now, the range of these photographs, as you know, are all endless, and probably this is the worst case scenario, I would imagine, of the Mona Lisa and everyone with their camera. But then I was equally, well, I don't know what to say. And this is not an indictment of any particular museum. These just happen to be the ones that I thought are quite interesting in terms of what people do when they're photographing within the museum. I mean, I think the desire to photograph a work on your phone, I do it. I buy postcards too, is not a new idea. And, we can go back to the 19th century and the early travel guides that came into being. These began in 1820, published in Germany, in a direct response to the Grand Tour. So the experience was to go to the place, and the books provided you with the information to be able to understand or delve into where you were. So this idea, in a sense, is not new. Now we all have it in a handy little device. So I thought it would be interesting. It was interesting for me to think about things in a somewhat historical context so that we don't always just lose sight of it seeming all new and kind of really start to break down the monolith a bit. This idea of looking, obviously, on the part of artists has also been very, very key. So Corbusier did his own grand tour, and these are his sketches and photographs from a visit to the Parthenon in Greece around 1911. And he filled nearly 80 sketchbooks as well with these very intense observations of the Parthenon, which then played a role in the later development of his architecture. So the museum, what is the museum? Where did it start? So the Cabinet of Curiosities, I think, is the beginnings of at least the desire to collect, to have these objects, to put them together, but not necessarily in any order that was necessarily informed by knowledge or information. Generally speaking, they were oddities, curious things. If you've ever been to the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, if you haven't been there, I encourage you to go, because it's a great example of a 19th century approach to thinking about medicine, much of which in some ways has probably now been disproved in terms of the organizations. So as information, as we have more data, we understand what things should be. The idea of the Artists Museum in this famous Charles Wilson Peale, also, you might as well go to Philly and see this as well. And, what's interesting about Peale's photograph is literally peeling back the curtain of this mysterious place. And if you look at how things are organized in the image, you will see the classifications are broken down by types of birds. And in some ways, this harkens back to the early idea of museums or galleries where things would be organized based on the schools, the Venetian school, the school of Florence. In a sense, it's a kind of pre-beginnings of art history. So, where do things begin to change? Well, I always am fascinated by two figures who, in many ways, are sort of polar opposites. One, of course, you all know, Alfred Barr, the founder of the Museum of Modern Art. And the other one maybe is less well known, and that's John Cotton Dana, who began life as the director of the Newark Public Library and then became the director of the Newark Museum. Dana had these beliefs at the time, and really being able to challenge the idea of, in fact, what he called the gloom of the museum. These are two publications that he produced very, very early on. You can see the dates. The New Museum is 1917. The Gloom of the Museum is 1917. In response to a desire to move beyond the static nature of the collection, to really make it come alive in some way. And in fact, he advocated having satellite galleries, not dissimilar to what the Whitney once had many years ago, in working class districts of the city, to bring a single work of art. So his desire was to connect with communities and public in not a prescribed way, but in a more unbounded way. Now, Barr, as we all know, had a much, much more prescriptive way of looking at things, and of course the famous diagram of Cubism and abstract art set out a historical an attempt to diagram influence and development. So we have these two ends of the spectrum in this way. Now, of course, at the Whitney, our principal job is in certain ways contradiction. It's filled with contradiction, I would say, in that we are balancing a responsibility to the art, the artists, and then the publics who come to the museum. And so when we get into this idea of shared spaces, this is where obviously we have tensions, we have conflicts, and I want to walk through a little bit of sort of how things play out in ways that I think are highly productive, and in other ways in which we listen to the desire of the artist, and then how do we balance that out. So my colleague Catherine Potts, who's head of education here, has a very art-centric and artist-centric approach, what we call a heads-up approach, literally meaning our preference is that people are working holding devices, as you can see here. And I think it's interesting. I think back to the Lizitzky Prown Room, and he could only have imagined this person who seems to be entering the painting itself in a very immersive sort of way. Or what we have now in our online site, that people can put together their collections from our collection. And I thought a lot about how is this the Wunderkammer of today? You can make your own personal cabinet of curiosities, albeit by reproductions, not the real thing, but your representation of that thing. Or we have an extraordinary number of videos online that range from Whitney stories, where our team has profiled, and Sarah Romack's been leading much of this charge, and in an education department, where we have interviews with artists that become accessible by virtue of this incredible classroom that can be online, or profiling aspects of our new building project, or Robert Indiana, a lecture. We have an amazing archive of information that allows people to see things. And I'm always amazed sometimes when I travel and go to places. I happened to be on a panel last year in Seoul, and there were a variety of artists who said they'd never been to the Whitney, but they've been to the Whitney website. And it was really always sort of wonderful. And it's like, gee, I wonder what the Whitney really means then, if you're experiencing it that way. And I thought, oh, that's really good. And I said, well, you should check this out on the website. So I think this thing of, what the possibilities are endless and deeply, deeply exciting. I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of where artists have taken us. And I think when we look at the Vermeer painting or the Mona Lisa, we're looking at the easel painting. And artists themselves have begun many years ago to want to be more immersive and even participatory, if you will. I think the classic example is Lizitzky's Prown Room from 1923, and his quote, "The painting is not a painting, but a structure around which we must circle, looking at it from all sides, peering down from above, investigating from below." Sirota happened to, when in his books, said that really saw this as indicative of the artist's desire to develop a new relationship between the object and the viewer. I think very much of someone like Barnett Newman and the whole generation of 50s painters that emerged, where they went even beyond the sense of the painting, the small easel painting, to make these immersive works. Newman's quote, and of course this Verrocus Sublimis, which is in MoMA's collection, is one of his great paintings from 1950-51. I think his quote is very interesting, which is obviously some years later, and I think just a few years before he died. I hope that my painting has the impact of giving someone, as it did me, the feeling of his own totality, of his own separateness, of his own individuality, and at the same time of his connection to others. I think that you can only feel others if you have some sense of your own being. By the way, I was tempted to put the slash his, her, but I didn't. So we'll take it as the universal one in that way. But, for Newman, what was so fundamental was the capacity to be able to get very close to the painting. And if there's a wonderful photograph you can easily Google and find of Betty Parsons, his dealer at the time, and Newman standing literally up to the painting, which now probably you cannot do, but also the sense of the materiality of the paint, that the material brought meaning with it. Or thinking about the phenomenological approach of artists such as Nauman, but many of the other artists engaged in the minimalist period of the 60s, and then Nauman's inclusion of video itself. When this idea of participation and bringing the visitor into a dialogue continues, and I thought a lot about the 93 Whitney Biennial, and there are probably some people in the room here who were here and wore those badges that Daniel Joseph Martinez had designed. Now, what's so interesting about them, as you can see in this slide, is that they were embedded amongst the standard Whitney badge. So, you didn't just get this, maybe you got this, or you didn't get the other one. What I thought was sort of really amazing about that project was that one hoped, and I think it was his desire, that whoever wore that badge took on a kind of critical consciousness, that you became conscious of whether you were black, white, whatever, whether you wanted to be, whether you didn't want to be. So there became this interaction in a deeply meaningful sort of way. Now I go what I call to the full-blown experience, and I happened to work at Tate Modern during the time of Olafur Eliasson's Weather Project. Now, in this situation, the visitors interacted in a variety of different ways. There were people who brought picnics and spread them out. Now, of course, anybody here who's lived in the UK knows that the absence of sun during certain parts of the year is a real bummer. And if you have effective light, whatever, I think it's effective season disorder where you can have your own light, people literally basked in this light. Now, the question sort of came up of, well, what was really going on? Was this a spectacle? What in fact was this really going on? So then we have artists living in the gallery itself. So just a couple of quick case studies that we always have to balance, and that was Dawn Casper. But I'm getting a warning from Gordon, so I got to speed it up. Walter de Maria tightly controls the photographs of his work, and if you've ever been to the lightning field, you're told that you cannot photograph there. He believes that isolation is the essence of earth art. Barbara Kruger did an interesting project with the Hirshhorn, where she, for one day, participated in a Twitter dialogue. And if you have a moment to go to that website and see what's archived, it's actually sort of some amazing discussions. Project we did this past summer, Robert Irwin's Scrim Vale, Black Rectangle, Natural Light, Whitney Museum of American Art, which is one that I curated with my colleague Jane Panetta, was a very interesting case study. Now, this piece had been shown in 1977. We got involved with Irwin to ask him how he wanted to move about with this. We wanted to do a variety of things. He just wanted to show this piece. Now, this is the photograph of the piece at the time. He was very clear about when we could use new photographs and when we could not. You could only use black and white photographs, and they had to have no people in them. And at the time, once the show opened, in fact, and the New York Times came, he would only allow this photograph to be shown. Now, the other thing that he was very clear about was what he said is that he did not want any other visual excitation, meaning that he wanted people to enter into the piece itself, not necessarily knowing, other than signage in the lobby, what it was. So our solution was to have a back gallery, which you just saw in that right room there, into which all the materials fell, which was text panels and all of that. And so that the idea of the experience of the work, the spatialized experience of the work, was something that you had to come to. In fact, we were not even allowed to have the audio guide about the work prior to being in it, because it was really about that notion of surprise and perception. I think if you saw the Tino Segal piece at the Guggenheim, he did not allow any photography of that piece. So, the idea of being in the moment, of the experience of the piece, it's a philosophical approach of his part. So where does that put us? Now you can see what we deal with. An artist wants it, an artist doesn't want it. We're the go-between. And I thought a lot about, okay, so what happens? What is my update on Sirota's experience or interpretation would be what I would call experience or information. And, what does this mean when one sees this? What does it mean? What does it say about the function of art within our culture, our attitudes to it? These are all questions. I don't have answers. I hope someone here has answers, but I think the job of us tonight is to problematize. What is it that what does art mean today? What does it mean for people? And the other thing I just wanted to end with is this idea of shared spaces again, and what that phrase seems to imply. Because to me it implies a kind of agreement that we're all participating in this space. Now, it raises the question, and we've all been in this scenario where someone has their phone and they're videotaping, and I don't know, do you want to be part of someone else's documentary of their life? What happens to that information? So, there's a pro and a con to all of this, but I find it really interesting at a time when we're also so disturbed and fascinated by this information, all kinds of information being archived, and potentially we don't know where it's going. And I want to end with the film still from Laura Poitras's yet-to-be-released film, which is about the building of the National Security Agency's data storage out in Utah, of where all these things go. So it seems that there's a lot of contradiction between our desire to document, to share, to be recorded, and at the same time, where does that go, and how do we feel about it? So thanks all very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Jonathan Crary.